The Aston Martin racing team has been a laughingstock in the recent past. They first started out as a more money-oriented, less technical team. Essentially, it takes more than throwing money at a car to compete in Formula One. But since the beginning of the 2023 racing season, they've made quite a lot of improvements on the technical side. Presently, they are second on the leaderboard, and there is hope within the Aston Martin team ranks that they could do better and perhaps upset Red Bull from the first position. The racing year is still young, and this is a real possibility, all things being equal. But the efficiency of the Red Bull car might prove hard to outdo. So what specific advantages can the Aston Martin team utilize to actually beat a Red Bull car that is already looking unbeatable? Here's what we think and know. Stay tuned. First off, the Aston Martin car has received massive updates in every way conceivable, and the upgrades had to begin with the leadership. Aston Martin was once called Racing Point with a lot of monetary backing. Back in 2020, the Racing Point team knew very little about the sport, as evident in the poor 2021 and 2022 challenges. Racing Point was soon rebranded as Aston Martin in 2021. All of a sudden, we see this team a year or two later chasing down great pole positions in stark contrast to the previous year. This proves that a lot of work was put into being a lot more competitive. And the first thing you might notice is the change in leadership. New engineers like Dan Fallows were hired who knew exactly what to do to improve Aston Martin's standings. Another thing that worked in Aston Martin's favor was the drive to be independent from the other teams. There are only a handful of engine manufacturers and parts makers, so the market that serves all the Formula One teams is exclusive. But Aston found a way to separate itself from the rest somehow. For instance, Mercedes manufactures the engines for the Aston Martin race car, as well as those for one or two other racing teams. Mercedes also has its own racing team, as such interests can get conflicted in theory. To that end, Aston Martin are currently building their own purpose-built wind tunnel, amongst other things. The irony of it all turns out to be that the Aston Martin race car is based on a Mercedes engine, and yet Mercedes is far behind in the leadership rankings. And the difference between Aston Martin's and the Mercedes team is the build of their respective cars. While the Mercedes race car experienced quite the flurry of problems, the Aston Martin car is obviously doing quite well. This is mostly because of the varying design philosophies of both team cars. While the Mercedes engineers dumbed down on the technicalities, the Aston Martin engineers simply followed the template used by Red Bull. And the results are beginning to show. Agreed. The Aston Martin team are presently hugging the second-place position and could at least attempt to upset Red Bull, but presently that is unlikely, or perhaps it could happen down the road. Again, the racing year is still young, and if Aston Martin makes all the right moves, their dreams might come true. It's funny that the Aston Martin team is also known as the Green Red Bull team, which says a lot. But the first upgrade to be deployed as early as the Baku race by the Aston Martin team is a new rear wing. And if you consider that they finished 7th on the Constructors' Championship last year, it means they have more tunnel time according to the latest regulations. To put this advantage in perspective, Red Bull, who are first on the board, have 10% less tunnel time. And this disparity could start to show as the racing calendar stretches on. In essence, Aston Martin could capitalize on that advantage somehow. Alonso even gave us a glimpse of what to expect going into the next race. Add to that the fact that 2-3 of the Aston Martin car will be constantly changing as the year wears on. So the AMR 23 is a work in progress thanks to the team's access to wind tunnel testing. Add that to the fact that other teams don't quite have this advantage the way Aston Martin does. This is what Tom McCullough, the performance director at Aston Martin, had to say. So the more time you have, the more sessions you can do, and the more things you can analyze. Every week, we are in the wind tunnel, looking for development avenues that can bring significant performance, while keeping the cost ceiling in mind from Baku onwards, and certainly parts will come in. It's really the process that everyone is involved with right now. Keep in mind that Verstappen and Alonso drive the most effective and dominant cars on the grid, given the fact that they can brake later and accelerate earlier in low and medium speed corners. This usually requires a huge amount of downforce generation out of your car. So in reality, the AMR 23 is very easy, while the RB19 is presently the slightly better car overall. But that could change. Red Bull's dominance didn't surprise anyone going into 2023, but the Aston Martin's team have so far exceeded everyone's expectations as it has risen to become a viable challenger this season. And if you consider that Aston Martin's has been granted more tunnel time than Red Bull, they could very well use it to shave a lot more seconds from their lap speeds, and in effect make the car more aerodynamically efficient. On their part, Ferrari and Mercedes have been granted tunnel time boosts in the region of 10% and 17% respectively. But in real terms, this is not enough to do all you need to do. Or at least, it's not enough tunnel time to be able to test for a significant shave off your lap time. But then there's the Aston Martin performance at the Australian circuit. It was a little less than expected. Alonso lost the second-place battle against Hamilton. Pundits have since figured that the AMR23 is a car that is more suited to rear-limited racetracks. The Melbourne Australian track was the opposite of what the Aston Martin car thrives on. In truth, Aston Martin didn't really pose a challenge to Mercedes and Hamilton in Melbourne. And it's not just about the racetrack. The Mercedes team does see all that is happening, and so they won't just fold their arms and call it all off. In fact, there were noticeable improvements in the Mercedes setup going into the Melbourne race. Mercedes barely came behind the Red Bull car. Again, according to Tom McCulloch, the RB19 car is very strong on efficiency. The DRS effect is quite strong, but it's also very strong on the straights. Also remember, Albert Park has a high sensitivity to DRS because there are 4 zones in a relatively short lap. And the Red Bull car just so happens to be a strong car in the corners, as well as being very strong on the straights. Ultimately, Tom provided hope for all the Aston Martin fans, and quite frankly speaking, all of the Formula One fans in terms of where he thinks the Red Bull's advantage comes from. He said, it's more likely that the RB19's advantage is fundamentally aerodynamic efficiency, but also admitted he doesn't have all the data. But if this theory is proven to be true, then the battle comes down to aerodynamic efficiency, to which the Aston Martin's team are already better poised to exploit. During the past winter break, there was a freeze on car development, but that has since been reversed for the Easter break, which will extend for 3 weeks. Afterwards, it's on to the Baku and Emilia GP racing dates, and we expect to see a more dominant outing for the Aston Martin setup from there onwards. Baku might in fact be a pivotal turning point for Aston Martin, but if not Baku, we can expect a win for Aston Martin sooner than later. This much the Aston Martin boss, Lawrence Stroll, admitted. His own son, Lance Stroll, is an Aston Martin race driver, and the expectations from both fans and teams for Aston Martin putting up a good challenge is heavy on the air. Sadly or not, it won't be Lance mounting the podium, and it's more likely going to be Alonso, and Lawrence will accept that possibility for the sake of the team any day. Presently, Aston Martin poses the only threat to Red Bull's dominance. Also, Mercedes is conveniently waiting on the wings. The fact that the wind tunnel time granted to Aston Martins is quite generous means they can at least work wonders if they utilize it properly. On their part, Mercedes is yet to test the new design of the W14 due to wind tunnel constraints, and it took them a year and a half to admit this. So what do you guys think about the Aston Martin challenge against Red Bull? Do you think that Aston Martin can work out an aerodynamic advantage that will improve their car? Perhaps they can even win a race sooner rather than later. When exactly do you think this might happen? Let us know about your thoughts in the comments section below.